What would the world look like if instead of going into the chicken business, Colonel Sanders had actually won his Senate seat in 1951 and went on to become president? What if Walt Disney served as president in 1952? Or if this guy, Henry VIII, had had his son slightly earlier and so didn't have to have 6 wives and end up killing 2 of them? We will explore all of these alternate timelines and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is black coffee with cream, and join me as we explore the alternate history's iceberg. July's People is a 1981 novel that takes place in South Africa in the near future, where a violent uprising ends up happening, the government is overthrown, the apartheid is ended, and because of this, a bunch of the white middle class and upper class families have to basically try and seek safety elsewhere. So the timeline follows this one family, the Smails, and they are living in Johannesburg. They're kind of in danger, so they go with one of their black servants, July, to stay with him in safety with his family in his village. And the story just kind of goes on from there. The Smails family, especially the mum Maureen, kind of find it hard to adjust to this new life. You know, they have to leave all of their stuff behind. They're living in a village instead of their middle to upper class home. And also the power dynamic is kind of shifted. You know, you had the black people being oppressed under the apartheid in South Africa, with the white people kind of feeling superior. You know, they had black servants, but now they're staying in someone else's village, and they are kind of now dependent on these villagers, on their former black servant July, for their food, water, their safety. And so the power dynamic, the power shift, is kind of flipped around. It's an interesting perspective, an interesting look into the whole apartheid thing. And this book has actually been banned multiple times over the years for stuff like, but not limited to, questionable subject matter, unacceptable language, perceived racism, you know, whatever that means, as well as a few different reasons. Crisis in the Kremlin is an alternate history written by Konrad Sartorius, in which Mikhail Gorbachev is overthrown in 1989, resulting in new leadership for the Soviet Union. And this new leadership consists of Yegor Ligachev, the KGB chief Vladimir Kryuchkov, the defense minister Dmitry Yazov, and the foreign minister Alexander Ivanov, who actually only exists in this alternate timeline. And under this new leadership, things get extremely brutal. There are many deaths, famines, food shortages, and anyone who basically advocates for or supports democracy, you know, votes, democratic rights, freedoms, they're all basically stamped out and slaughtered. And the people don't really take this lying down, as they arrange a bunch of these sneaky guerrilla attacks back at the government. And so there is an absolute ton of fighting in this alternate timeline. The Soviet Union itself kind of shifts around. There are countries leaving, joining, these puppet states being set up all around the place. And there are wars all over Europe. There's wars in Korea and Asia. Nelson Mandela is actually killed in South Africa, and the South African government kind of gets surrounded, outnumbered, and so they end up using nukes on the protesters and the counter-revolutionaries to, you know, try and halt their progress. And this Soviet rule does kind of last for a few years before they themselves are overthrown. And when they're overthrown, the new leaders transform the, you know, socialist USSR into the democratic USR, or the Union of Sovereign Republics. And the USSR in this timeline even has plans to, after they're defeated, you know, they still don't give up. They have plans to take all of their leaders, all of their Soviet citizens, and just move everyone out to Siberia, where they would live and work in these deep Siberian mines, basically building the perfect utopian Soviet society out there, and then eventually become stronger and stronger. And their plans were to do all that and then to take over the Soviet Union, or, you know, the USR, but the plan was to take back all of the land that they lost, and then eventually, you know, all of Europe, and then all of the entire world. But thankfully, it hasn't come to that yet. No Spanish Civil War in 1936 is exactly what it says on the tin. An alternate history where Spain never faced a civil war, or at least never faced the one in 1936. Francisco Franco never ends up becoming the Spanish dictator, which he later became. And this timeline kind of is split in two in a way, where early on it explores the internals of the civil war. So, you know, it's heavily Spanish based. It's in the coup attempt, or the coup planning. And in this alternate timeline, kind of at the last second, the coup is discovered and then thwarted. Whereas in our our timeline, they never discovered the coup plans, and then this takeover ended up happening. Francisco Franco became a dictator. But yeah, in this timeline, the plans are discovered fairly early. The conspirators or coupists are, stamped out, and this would mean, according to this timeline, a more democratic Spain as opposed to a dictatorial one, at least as far as the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And it's a pretty interesting timeline. No super major changes happen. Like, there's no invention of plasma guns or time travel machines or anything. But it does lead to a more brutal, I guess, kind of 30s, 40s when compared to our timeline. And this alternate timeline is only up to 1943 at this point. So there's still a fair way to go in terms of alternate history. But yeah, pretty cool one. No W. So this takes place in an alternate timeline where George W. Bush, and it's just a lot more fun to say W like that, but George W. Bush dies in the year 2000 in a car crash, which obviously being dead prevents him from becoming president. And so because he can't be elected, the Republicans instead nominate John McCain for their pick. And so the election is between John McCain and Al Gore, and John McCain does win and rules the United States for all of 1 year, or actually less than 1 year, until on 9/11 the towers are still hit, and while making his way back to the White House, the presidential helicopter Marine One ends up, as it's trying to land, it kind of goes into a crazy death spiral and then just crashes into the ground, blows up, and kills everyone on board, including President John McCain. So then Vice President Dick Cheney ends up becoming, acting president, or I guess he's just sworn in as the full president because John McCain is dead, and he takes Colin Powell as his vice president. And then a year after this, Dick Cheney gets a heart attack, and so Colin Powell is sworn in as the acting president. So yeah, 3 presidents in 2 years. But basically this timeline says that without W in there, without old Georgie in the presidency, things just spiral out of control after the 9/11 attacks. Anti-Muslim sentiment just skyrockets all across America, and partly in retaliation to this, anti-Western sentiment also spreads among Muslims. So you have the US invading Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and Iran. There is a plane flown into the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. St. Paul's Cathedral in London is hit by a truck bomb. There are a bunch of crazy other attacks in London, in various cities in America, and these all together kill hundreds of people. 2 Pakistani men try to assassinate Mary Cheney, who is President Dick Cheney's daughter, and they just go up to Mary as she's eating food with her girlfriend, shoot her and her girlfriend, but don't end up killing either one of them. And then a reverend gets up on TV and says, yeah, I hope that convinces Mary to see the error of her ways, to reconsider her life choices. Which, that's a hell of a thing to say. But this basically leads to a massive divide in America, where you have the extremely conservative, extremely Christian religious people. They're kind of slowly gaining more and more power. A ton of gay and lesbian people end up going to Canada for, perceived safety. These Middle Eastern attacks in the West keep on happening. Over in the UK, Prime Minister Tony Blair is shot and killed while out for a morning run. And then eventually, with only 1 year left on the presidential ticket, Dick Cheney dies from a heart attack while giving a speech, making Colin Powell the official president. A nuke is somehow dropped in Moscow, killing Vladimir Putin as well as a ton of higher-ups, which spirals Russia into this civil war. They go a little bit crazy, and then in America, Senator Rick Santorum ends up being elected president, and he tries to bring in this super fundamentalist kind of Christian state and sentiment all across America. And it's basically a dictatorship at this point. Anyone who disagrees with Santorum's policies, anyone who criticizes him or his plans or his party members or anything like that, they're either shut out, they're sued to oblivion, they're disappeared, or they're just killed outright. And he passes a bill forcing all gay people in America to either undergo conversion therapy, to face jail time, or to leave America altogether. And at least partly because of this, there are a ton of comics, writers, actors, musicians who end up leaving and just fleeing to Canada in order to preserve their freedoms. Notably, Matt Stone and Trey Parker from South Park, which I don't think they're blaming Canada in this timeline. So yeah, honestly, it is an insane old history. It's actually quite easy to read. It's not super history heavy. So if you want something that's kind of fun, kind of different, quite light to read, or if you like the sound of it, you want to hear more, absolutely go check it out. Voyage is an alt history written in 1996, in which JFK survives in 1963, and after Apollo 11, successfully ends up having a man walk on the moon. And with JFK still alive, he and LBJ both come together and vow that they will put a man on their next favorite celestial body, that being the sun. Now, that would be impossible. They plan to put a man on Mars. And so in this timeline, they basically ignored the whole space shuttle program. They focused more on space travel, and they basically put all of their resources and efforts into getting up to Mars, and especially into getting a crewed mission up to Mars. So they cancel a bunch of the other space programs, a bunch of the moon missions they end up canceling, a bunch of the space probes they end up canceling or delaying. They reallocate tons of money from all over the space program into this one goal, this one mission, and they do eventually get to Mars, but ironically, due to cancelling all of the other missions, all of the other space stuff, they get to Mars, but they actually know less about Mars than we do in this timeline. And they know less about the rest of space, the rest of the solar system, the galaxy, the distant stars, because they cancelled a lot of the research. Because we, in this timeline, sent out probes, we sent out, the rover little machine, we've slowly built up knowledge about Mars, whereas in this timeline, everything was focused on just getting there. And so that came at the cost of knowledge. So yeah, it's a very cool one. It's very scientifically and space-ifitically accurate. So yeah, fun one, definitely go check it out. The Forest of Time takes place in a world where the Pennsylvanian/Connecticut Wars, or rather minor disputes of the 1770s and 80s, end up going a little bit differently. They're both fighting over who owns the rights to the Wyoming Valley, and in our timeline, this dispute is eventually settled quite fairly, with the land going to Pennsylvania, but the people on the land being granted full citizen rights in Pennsylvania, and with the promise to, not disturb them, not kick them out sort of thing. But in this timeline, George Washington ends up going down to this area, where these two warring militias are trying to fight for this land, and he, along with a bunch of other soldiers, kind of gets in the middle, tries to stop this whole fight. He ends up in the crossfire between these two militias, and he ends up dying. And this was just as the Constitution was being written up, being made legal, and then Benjamin Franklin ends up getting a stroke and dying. And so with two of the founding fathers being, yoinked away to Sleepy Town, the Constitution was never adopted, and America just kind of remains as these individual states. These states eventually do become independent countries, but you don't have the big United States of America. The timeline basically takes us through Pennsylvania trying to hold its ground against Connecticut and a bunch of other states. And I don't know how many people I've annoyed saying Connecticut, but it's just a lot more fun than Connecticut. And the dominant language being spoken in Pennsylvania is something called Pennsylvanish, which is kind of a German language that is mixed with little bits of English, and this is due to their founders. And this is not too far from reality. We have something called Pennsylvanian Dutch in our timeline, but it is kind of a minor spoken language as opposed to being the main dominant language in this timeline. And that is obviously partly because if Pennsylvania became its own country, it'd more have like a national identity with a national language, whereas in our timeline, they're all just states. They're all a little more, flowy in between one another. But the actual story of this timeline is there is a Pennsylvanian officer who finds this strange man in a forest, and this strange man is claiming to be from a country called the United States of America. Yeah, very odd. And the officer has obviously never heard of a country like this, but the man tells him that this is a world where all of these great countries of North America, the country of Connecticut, the country of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Colorado, all of these countries are actually just states in the larger country of the United States of America. It spans from sea to sea, held together by something called the American Constitution and bald eagles and bacon. So this officer thinks that this man is at best insane and at worst just like a spy for New York or something. So he arrests the man, and the man all the while tells him of these tales that he's gone through, where he said he's been traveling around from timeline to timeline. He visited one in which the Axis powers won World War II, which I mean, it's not very creative. We've seen about 24 of those so far. One where nuns are being hung from lampposts, which, okay, that's quite unique. And this is possibly a reference or a nod to Eric Norden's The Ultimate Solution. And one where French Europeans control England and America, and they practice magic because why not? And this one is potentially a nod to Lord Darcy. There's one where a nuke has gone off and America is kind of like a nuclear wasteland. One where Philly was inhabited by ancient Japanese samurai, which pretty cool. And one where the Native Americans were more or less advanced as the Europeans. And as the Europeans were discovering the Americas, the Native Americans also landed in Ireland. And so, with them both being kind of equally strong, they agreed not to fight and to instead come together. And this leads to kind of worldwide peace, to a lot of the countries in the world uniting, and to them advancing in space travel, going to Mars, and actually setting up a colony there in as early as the 20th century. The Last Starship from Earth takes place in a world where Jesus wasn't this peaceful turn-the-other-cheek guy. Instead, he was a violent counter-revolutionary who overthrew the Roman Empire and established a full-blown theocracy and was eventually killed by a crossbow. And so the believers in Christ in this timeline, they wear like a little crossbow symbol, much like we wear the cross in our timeline. The theocracy that Jesus founded lasts to the modern day, so like 2,000 years, and it is a global superpower, mixing this strict theological rule with advanced weapons and technology, with one example being an AI pope. Like, imagine ChatGPT as the top religious figure in the entire society. Sounds pretty wild. But within this Jesus tech society, people are split up into these castes, much like you have in India, and it is very frowned upon to mix with other people in different castes, but especially to fall in love with them, to have relationships with them. And so in this timeline, there is a mathematician who falls in love with a poetess from another caste, and for this, he is exiled to hell, which is really just like a distant planet. So he gets charged for this, he gets shot up to this distant planet, and when he gets there, he learns of this secret plot where this poetess was actually sent down to Earth in order to get a clever mathematician to fall in love with her, and then because they're from different castes, he would end up getting charged and getting sent up to hell. And that is because they needed a mathematician up on hell in order to finish their time machine, which is a wild plot in a story. But he ends up completing the time machine for them. They end up going back in time, changing things a little bit, and it does end up becoming a little more like our timeline. Resurrection Day is another Cuban Missile Crisis gone wrong timeline, and results in the Soviet Union and the US basically being blown to smithereens, and with the US having to rely on UK aid basically to survive. And with two of these major, world powers basically destroyed, that kind of destabilizes the whole world. Smaller countries end up either having civil wars or having wars between themselves and neighboring countries. The nukes that hit Russia end up kind of flowing down over Asia and killing thousands of people. Europe basically remains kind of untouched, which is always great. But China ends up having these civil wars, it collapses among all these different warlords, and America is seen as kind of the bad guy across the entire world. Asia blames them for the nuclear fallout. Obviously, Russia blames them for the nukes. And the rest of the world also blames them for fighting in this war. They could have taken the higher ground. They could have done something to prevent it. And so a lot of the US military personnel are advised not to travel abroad, probably because people will start bonking them to death. And this opinion of America is partly due to the fact that people say that JFK was like this hot-headed, impatient, arrogant, war-hungry leader, and the Air Force tried to stop it kind of at the last second, but they ended up failing, and that's what triggered the war. Except later on in the timeline, they discover that JFK was absolutely against this war, and he was actually close to a peace deal with Khrushchev towards the end, but it was the US military who basically ended up sabotaging these talks and more or less started the war, which, yeah, that kind of checks out. Oh, and Cuba is basically this atomic wasteland. Britain is looking to kind of coup d'etat America, get revenge for the whole 1776 thing. And yeah, That's the timeline. In the presence of mine enemies is another Adolf Wins timeline by our favorite author, Harry Turtledove. And I feel like if he didn't write stories, then alt histories just wouldn't be a thing. But the bad guys win World War II, then go on to fight another world war in the 1960s, which Germany also wins, leaving the US and Canada and a lot of the rest of the world basically in ruins, or at least a lot weaker than before. Britain is taken over by Germany, as is a lot of Africa. The Japanese, after winning these wars, basically has this huge empire in Asia, and the Germans kind of invade the US. They install this puppet government where it's not technically the Germans owning it, but if you know anything about puppet governments, you'd know it's basically the Germans owning it. And the US, under this puppet government, starts killing off Jews in America, as well as black people. And any black people that are left, they end up shipping them all across the world, all across the German Empire, to basically be used as free labor. So yeah, it is a horrific timeline. The Polish, the Russians, the Ukrainians, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Serbians, they're all killed off, as they're seen as, you know, an inferior race. The Arabs are also attacked because they're seen basically as Jews by the Germans. As I said, most of Africa basically gets annihilated or enslaved. And in a strange twist of events, South Africa, because they keep their apartheid, the black people there aren't enslaved or killed, but rather they're just kept as second-class citizens, which is like better, I guess, than being killed and enslaved, but still absolutely not great. Iranians and Indians are actually not attacked because they're seen as members of the Aryan race, which interestingly enough they kind of are if you go into the history of it. The main party in the UK is BUF, or the British Union of Fascists, which just kind of just rolls off the tongue, that. So basically, if you're German, if you're in Germany, things are, you know, pretty great. But if you're almost anyone else, almost anywhere else, things are pretty much hell. Losing the peace. So imagine a world, it's 1945, and President Truman dies when a chandelier collapses on him. So Henry Morgenthau becomes president, and he basically sees it as his job to punish Germany for World War II, and in a way to kind of get vengeance. And this world is just insane. As I said, Morgenthau becomes president, he starts killing Germans, he goes into Germany, he basically destroys it, blows it to smithereens. He takes all of the resources in Germany, he takes all of the best scientists and the best people, brings them over to America, and basically just leaves Germany as this desolate place, you know, with almost no money in the country, with no politicians, with no scientists, with no technology, basically stunting their progress for like at least 100 years. And then for some reason he turns his hatred towards the Jews and black people in America. He invades and destroys Israel and gives the land all over to the local Arabs. He basically brings back segregation in America by reintroducing these insane Jim Crow laws. China gets blown to smithereens, the Korean leader is killed, Mao is actually killed as well, and slowly America basically just becomes like a dictatorship where the Constitution and the rules of law are basically ignored. Being gay is now a crime. Entire groups and sects of people are now locked up under the, you know, guise, the excuse of terrorism. And the entirety of America basically falls into a second Great Depression, with a ton of American citizens actually deciding to leave America for Russia in search of, you know, jobs, opportunity, education, etc. The Selma Massacre. So in this timeline, the Selma Montgomery March ends up a lot worse, you could say, than in our timeline. In this alternate timeline, Alabama state troopers actually end up opening fire on some of the crowd, and they kill dozens of protesters during this, as well as, quite importantly, Martin Luther King Jr. This basically tips the civil rights activists, you know, over the edge, and instead of protests and fairly peaceful demonstrations, they become a lot more angry, a lot more violent, a lot more destructive. They change their motto from "We shall overcome" to "By any means necessary." And obviously because of this, the government pushback against them becomes more escalated, and this whole thing just turns into an incredibly bloody, destructive civil rights movement, leading to the deaths and injuries of many, many more people, and the deaths of notably Muhammad Ali, President Johnson, and George Wallace. Then because of this back and forth, this escalation of violence, Alabama actually ends up deputizing the KKK, so, you know, essentially making them legal law enforcement. So yeah, this cannot end well. It's quite an easy timeline to read. They're quite kind of short, concise posts, and there's nothing too, super academic or in-depth in this. So, as I said, makes for somewhat of an easy read. A World of Laughter, A World of Tears is a timeline in which Walt Disney is elected president in 1952 and not Eisenhower. Eisenhower basically has a heart attack, he steps down from the nomination, and old Walty boy ends up getting nominated by the party, partly as kind of a joke, partly just for the publicity. Like, yeah, everyone knows Walt Disney, look at this super famous guy we're having run as our candidate. And so Disney wins quite decisively in the election, and the presidential term starts off quite well, with him being a fairly well-meaning president, but slowly, bit by bit, he does kind of get in over his head. The whole politics world is a little too much for him, and he more and more seems to make, terrible decisions, but often with the best intentions. So, for example, he does actively support racial segregation in America, but only after the case of Emmett Till, which this happened in our timeline as well, but this was this tragic case of this 14-year-old black kid who was basically abducted and lynched just because some people say that he was, flirting with a white woman. He was looking at her in a funny way, so she felt threatened, so you had a bunch of guys go after him. They grabbed him and actually ended up lynching and killing him. So horrible, horrible case. But in this timeline, Disney supported segregation because he said because of this case, it kind of showed him that black people and white people weren't ready to live together. So he was supporting segregation, but basically to protect black people. And as I said, he does this throughout the timeline. He means or intends for the best, but it doesn't often end up going the way that he planned. So he becomes depressed, he starts drinking quite heavily, and basically just ends up becoming a puppet, just a mask where maybe he gives speeches or appears here and there, but he doesn't really make any of the decisions. And President Disney, which sounds very strange to say, but Disney ends up surviving an assassination attempt, and there's some mouse themes in this timeline, because of Mickey Mouse, but there's this group of kind of fanatic government youth, which are a little reminiscent of the ones in Germany in World War II, and they're called the Mouseketeers, and they wear these little armbands, which are also reminiscent of, World War II Germany, but they end up being this hyper-patriotic group, and the government slowly ends up turning against basically any group that's not middle class or higher, and or white and or Christian. But this Mickey Mouse Club, basically this nationalistic youth group, they end up, along with the government, basically stamping out the entire civil rights movement, and any sort of counterculture, whether that's among artists or musicians, writers, actors, they end up stamping all that out. And you have people like Marilyn Monroe, Elvis, for example, they all end up going to Europe, where there's more creative freedoms to be themselves, to produce art. George Lincoln Rockwell ends up being elected to the Senate, which, if you want to research this guy, he is not a good guy. The Disney animation department basically just starts making animations, making stuff for the American government, and ends up basically being a propaganda department. So it is a wild timeline. It was finished in 2010, and its sequel, When You Wish Upon a Star, was started initially, and then it went on a pretty long hiatus before being restarted in 2019, and it is still currently being written if you would like to follow along. The Fountainhead Filibuster, Tales from Objectivist Katanga. So if you haven't heard of Ayn Rand, this is her. And she was an American-Russian writer who basically invented the philosophy of objectivism. And I'll summarize it for you here, but it basically says that objective reality is all that there is. Individual rights are one of the most important things in a society or in life, and that people should basically do whatever they want all the time and never give in to authority. And she argued that this would result in a much better, much fairer society, and that personal happiness and personal freedoms is the best metric to measure any society by. So in this timeline, L. Ron Hubbard, of all people, comes up to her, inspires her, and she decides to create a kind of test utopia, a test society utilizing objectivism. And so she starts raising funds, she starts getting support from politicians, and ends up getting this small area in the Congo, more specifically in Katanga, and starts her own little town of Galtville. And the idea is to run this town fully on objectivism and to show the rest of the world that she would basically be able to create a utopia. And things pretty quickly go south from here. In just a few years, she ends up becoming a dictator. She regularly shoots anyone who disagrees with her, who goes against her rule. And the quality of life in this town is incredibly poor. She ends up enslaving the surrounding people for the town. Everything in these shops is just crazy expensive, like no one can afford it. And her military is basically a funded militia. But when she starts having disagreements within the town and with the UN and in the surrounding countries, a lot of bullets start flying here and there. A lot of the funds start drying up, which discourages a lot of the people working for her. And so her soldiers end up quitting. As I said, the UN and the Congo end up slowly surrounding her, and it is an insane timeline. The C.S.A, or Confederate States of America, is once again another alternate timeline where the Confederate States end up winning the Civil War, which in this timeline they did that through securing funding and support from Britain and France. And this is kind of written as a mockumentary style film, which is like a documentary made to look real, but it's actually fake, kind of like, you know, The Office or Borat sort of thing. But this is a mockumentary made in universe in the UK and broadcast as we're watching it in America. And it's pretty in-depth. It comes with these fake commercials, like in-universe commercials, and all of this fake historical footage, obviously this fake historical timeline. But basically the timeline is President Lincoln ends up losing the war, and then he tries to escape to Canada dressed in the disguise of blackface, which I don't know about that. I mean, he might fit in with Trudeau, but that's besides the point. He is allowed to live and then eventually exiled to Montreal. As I said, the Confederates win the war. Slave owning is written into the Constitution as a right. They eventually end up invading southward into Central and South America as well. And they join Germany in World War II because why not? And fast forward to the modern day, the C.S.A is still powerful, they still suck, slavery is deeply ingrained into their society, and yeah, it is a horrible place. The Oswald Bastable Trilogy. So these were these 3 books written by Michael Moorcock, which that is a great male stripper name. But this was in the 1970s and 80s. And the trilogy features mainly Captain Oswald Bastable in British India. And the year is 1902. He is sent on a mission to Kambalari, which is this independent area somewhere around India, Nepal, Tibet sort of region. And while he is there, his team basically gets captured. He manages to escape and then gets hit by an earthquake while underground, and when he wakes up, he finds himself in the 1970s. And he basically doesn't say anything to anyone because he doesn't want to freak them out. You know, it's unlikely they'll believe him, so he doesn't want to be locked up or arrested, which is probably fair enough. But eventually he's sent back to London. He gets a job in the Special Air Police, and he spends a while, you know, fighting for them, fighting for the Empire basically. And then he gets kidnapped again. He gets brought to this like top secret commune of exiled scientists and other people, all living in this valley in China. So it's like a Chinese Wakanda, like super advanced civilization sort of thing. And this commune wants to basically destroy the Empire. So they take this nuke and they go to set it off at this nearby airfield, which I say nearby, but it's in Hiroshima or Hiroshima. And this airfield is incredibly important to the Empire. It'll destroy a bunch of their important stuff. And when this blast goes off, it basically ends up sending Oswald back to the future.
When this baby hits 88 miles per hour, you're gonna see some serious shit.
Or back to the past, that being in the year 1903. So now while he's in the past again, Oswald goes back to this earthquake site, you know, where he originally time jumped, and he ends up time jumping again to the year 1904, so just a year later. But this is like an alternate 1904 where the whole world is seemingly at war. The Ashanti Empire basically ends up invading the US, many deaths happen. Oswald ends up time jumping again, this time to the 1940s where these great empires still exist. And in this one, the world is basically fully at war. And yeah, it is a wild story. With this one, I don't know if it is classed as a alternate timeline, but yeah, it is what it is. Now Blooms the Tudor Rose is apparently, according to a lot of people, the best Tudor-centric alternate timeline out there. And it asks the question, what if Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, what if she had given him a son as opposed to his third wife, Jane Seymour? Seymour? Well, this would mean Henry having a son 5 or so years earlier than he did in our timeline. And in this alternate timeline, they do actually have 3 sons and 2 daughters. And because he ended up having less wives, he ended up not having to kill half of them. And because he didn't kill so many, he's seen kind of more favorably in this timeline, as opposed to our one, where he's seen kind of like a crazy monster. And it's a wild alternate history that honestly reads a bit like, Game of Thrones. There's a ton of political and familial drama. It goes very deeply into the royalty and to plots and betrayal and betrothal and love, murder, wars, conquest, religion. It's all pretty great stuff. The world building is apparently fantastic, the characters are really well written and fleshed out, and although it does cover some quite serious topics, the commentary ends up taking the edge off because of how, sometimes snarky and sarcastic and lighthearted it is. So, if you like stuff like Game of Thrones, if you like medievally or Tudor evilly stuff, absolutely check it out. The Iron Dream is an alternate timeline where Adolf emigrates to the US, and this is following the First World War, and he ends up using his art skills to basically become a pulp fiction writer, and then later on a science fiction writer. And he writes these science fiction stories with like little sprinkles of fascist propaganda in there, and it makes for one hell of a timeline. And that's kind of the main story in the timeline. That's the story of the actual timeline itself. And then there's a second story within the timeline, and that second story is the story of Adolf's story that he writes. And the book that Adolf writes is called The Lord of the Swastika. Which, this book then becomes a Hugo Award-winning novel and is celebrated in, sci-fi conventions with a bunch of these unknowing nerds actually dressing up in the outfits and costumes and uniforms that a lot of the people in the novel were wearing. And as you can imagine, a lot of these uniforms were basically the bad guys from World War II. So yeah, a lot of people cosplaying as them. It's pretty wild, even though they don't really exist in this alternate timeline. But Adolf's party in Germany kind of rises and falls without him there. It collapses completely in the 1920s. Germany ends up facing a communist uprising in the 1930s. And because of this extra communist support, the Soviet Union obviously doesn't have to fight Germany. And so they end up actually invading the UK and a lot of South America, and eventually try to take over the entire world. Japan is one of the, semi-good guys in this story. And them, along with the US, along with Australia and New Zealand, are kind of some of the last bastions of freedom in the world, trying at all costs to stop the complete global takeover of the Soviet Union and of communism. And funnily enough, it's kind of thrown about in this timeline of, I wonder how different the world would be if Ferric Jagger was real. And Ferric Jagger is the main character in Adolf's novel, and it's kind of based on how Adolf was in our timeline, but a little more hero-y. But in this timeline, they're like, if only Ferric Jagger was real, the world would be so much different. We'd have a strong, competent leader, and he would be able to stop the Soviets. The world would be a utopia. And yeah, just how little they know. Yesterday is a fun film made in 2019 where a struggling musician by the name of Jack Malik is hit by a bus one day, and when he wakes up, he's just, going about his day, he's bopping along, he's trying to recover, and then he starts singing a Beatles song. And all of his friends are like, whoa, dude, that's a cool song. And he's like, it's just the Beatles. And they're like, Beatles who? And basically in this story, he wakes up in a timeline where the Beatles never existed. He can't find any records or evidence of them online. All of his albums and vinyls that he had are just non-existent. And so, because Jack still remembers a bunch of their music, he starts playing the songs, the Beatles songs, to his friends, to his family, to his audience, and they absolutely love it. He obviously doesn't really tell anyone he's passing off this music as his own, and he ends up getting signed by Ed Sheeran's manager, and is on the path to becoming rich and famous basically overnight, and is even strangely approached by these 2 suspicious people backstage who say that they also remember the Beatles. And they know that he didn't make this music, and he's passing it off as his own. But ultimately, they do thank him. They don't want to expose him, but they say, thank God someone else remembers, because we were worried that the Beatles would be, forgotten forever. So they give him the address of John Lennon, who in this timeline never became a famous musician, but he's still alive. Jack goes out to visit him, and they have kind of a little heart-to-heart. John says that he spent his life, just happy and a quiet little peaceful life, and thankfully isn't married to Yoko Ono in this timeline. And after this, he eventually comes clean with everyone. He says, I basically plagiarized all this, I didn't write any of it, but he releases it all online for people to enjoy and doesn't take any money from it. And then towards the end, he has this lovely little, rom-com moment with the main female character, and then he says, I feel basically as good as Harry Potter felt, when he defeated Lord Voldemort, which, firstly, that's a strange on-the-nose thing to say. I don't know anyone who's ever said that, in existence. But he says this, and then she's like, Harry Potter who? Lord Voldemort what? And then it's like, oh, yeah, I guess Harry Potter doesn't exist in this universe either. Nor does Coke, nor do cigarettes. And the magic behind this timeline is never explicitly revealed. But some theories have been that the most popular thing in every category doesn't exist in this timeline, which might possibly be true. You have Coke being basically the most popular soft drink, Harry Potter the most popular children's book, Beatles the most popular rock band, or band in general. I haven't looked at the statistics. But yeah, great film. It's not too serious. It has Beatles music in, which is always fantastic, and I would highly recommend it. The Last Empress is a Korean TV show with an alternate timeline where Korea isn't a republic, but they are a constitutional monarchy. And it's apparently a very good K-drama. It's very fast-paced. There's tons of action, tons of drama. It's like a Korean modern Game of Thrones. Lots of plots, scheming, royal families, murders, sneaky plot twists, thefts, sabotages. It's basically got everything. So it's not a very widespread alternate history. It doesn't really affect the rest of the world. But if you like K-dramas, definitely check it out. Kentucky Fried Politics is firstly an awesome sounding name for a timeline, or just a political party in general. But in 1951, Harland Sanders, the chicken guy, he did actually, even in our timeline, run for the Kentucky Senate, but he lost and then eventually went on to do other things, and then eventually, founded KFC. And so he never went into politics after his failed Senate race. But this timeline asks, what if he won the Senate race and then eventually went on to win the presidency? What would that presidency look like? And as a quick aside, fun fact about Colonel Sanders. So he started by running a petrol station or a gas station in America. And at this gas station, he was, providing gas for people, but he also had this little cafe, this little kind of pit stop, and there he would fry up this chicken, just in a pan, fry the chicken, serve it to people, make a little bit of extra money that way. And soon his chicken became so popular that more and more people came in. He wasn't able to make as much chicken as he was selling just pan frying it, so he started, pressure frying it, deep frying it, and then it became so popular that he made his own standalone chicken place, and then ended up branching it off as a franchisee sort of thing, and then ended up selling it. And he said originally that the gravy that he used to make, he said you could buy an entire meal, throw away all the chicken, all the chips, everything, and just keep this pot of gravy, and you would still feel like you've got your money's worth. Like, that's how good his gravy was. And he said when he sold it, the gravy that was produced in KFC after that, and even to this day, was basically wallpaper paste. He said it was horrible, you could barely stomach it, it had no flavor, it had no passion. And he actually used to travel from franchise to franchise, different KFC restaurants across America, and he used to order a meal, sit down, and if he didn't like it, then he would get his food, smash it on the floor, say, this is a horrible KFC place, you're ruining its name. And yeah, so he was very passionate about chicken. And actually one of his mentees, one of the guys that he was kind of hanging around that Colonel Sanders ended up teaching, he later sold his own KFC stocks and used the money to found another fast food restaurant, that being Wendy's. So yeah, now you know. But as I said, in this timeline, Sanders ends up becoming a senator and then later ends up running for the presidency, ends up winning and serving 2 terms. Barack Obama is actually adopted by John McCain and ends up going by Barack McCain now. And because he was adopted, Barack is now a Republican. The Cuban Missile Crisis takes place in, well, Turkey instead of Cuba, and it's probably not called the Cuban Missile Crisis in this timeline. J. Edgar Hoover ends up dying when President Chicken bonks him on the head with his stick, and it wasn't super hard, but Hoover ends up getting a brain aneurysm and just dying on the spot. There are a bunch of different names in this timeline as well. Netflix is named Net Films, which is a terrible name. YouTube is called Our Vids, which is even worse. CNN is named KNN after the Kennedys. Wikipedia is now Clickopedia. Nearly all of these Simpsons names have been changed. Ted Cruz was never born because his father died in the Cuban War. And I think most tragically of all, the Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends doesn't exist in this timeline, which I think I need a minute, guys. I'll be okay. John Lennon becomes Prime Minister of the UK. O.J. Simpson kind of gets reverse Uno'd, where they find him dead, and they bring in his girlfriend Nicole Brown for questioning. Natalie Portman and Hugh Jackman do end up having superhero roles, but they are Iris West from The Flash and Captain Boomerang instead of Jane Foster and Wolverine. Jeffrey flees the country, but as he's fleeing, his plane crashes into the ocean, which at least there's some good news in this timeline. Jeffrey Dahmer is actually killed by John Wayne Gacy, which is a bit strange, but it's probably a net positive. And old, creepy Jimmy is killed in prison. So maybe there's a few positives in this timeline. The X-Men aren't comic book characters. They are actually what the followers and supporters of Malcolm X have called themselves. And so when Stan Lee releases the X-Men, they go by their original name, which he first came up with, being the Mutants. And I could go on for hours about all of these tiny changes. Some are, mid-level, some are incredibly small, some are tragic, some are hilarious, but a bunch of them are pretty fun. So I would definitely recommend checking out the timeline for yourself. British Dominion in Southern America series. So this explores a timeline where Josiah Martin and Guy Carleton, who in our timeline were colonial governors for the British regions of Quebec and North Carolina, but in this alternate timeline, these men do get sent out to these 2 places, but they basically just get swapped around. So instead of this guy going to Quebec, this guy going to North Carolina, they just go instead to their opposite locations. And this small change has seemingly quite large ramifications. And this is due to the different styles, the different personalities of these 2 men, which leads to the Revolutionary War basically flipping, where the main kind of hold of the British is more in the south, and the main hold of the rebels are in the north. So in our timeline, where Canada, used to be British land, and south of that was America, instead you have America being kind of the northern land or Canada, and the southern area is at this point British. And the south, as it did in our timeline, does kind of heavily rely on cotton and tobacco, but not as heavily in our timeline, as because they have, financial support from Britain, they're able to diversify out their incomes, they're able to spread it around a bit, grow a whole range of different crops, like for example tea leaves in Carolina. Then there's kind of a civil war or a slave uprising. Slavery is abolished, the official country lines are kind of drawn, and the Dominion of Southern America basically consists of like the southern states as well as a bunch of the Caribbean. And the top half, what we know as, kind of the North of America, or the North USA and Canada, that becomes the USA in this timeline. So you have no Canada, you have the USA, and the USA in this timeline is kind of like our USA, except seemingly better in every way. They're loved by a bunch of nations all around the world. There's almost no inequality, there's a ton of fairness, low crime rates, they're super prosperous, and with North America being kind of split into these 2 countries, Mexico has room to grow stronger. They end up expanding south and controlling all of Central America. A lot of the Spanish colonies in South America end up grouping together as well, and they form the United Provinces of South America. And Brazil actually conversely ends up breaking up into smaller countries. A bunch of Europe is changed as well, like too much to go over, but the Scandinavian countries all form kind of like one big blob, almost like a meatball, a Swedish meatball, you could say. Australia and New Zealand are now owned by Britain and France. Japan is kind of split between Russia and Britain. China has this massive civil war, which results in this democratic China, in the southern part of China, called the United States of China. And it seems like every country on Earth is now like the United States of whatever country it is, which does make sense with everyone looking up to the USA and trying to, model their countries after them because they're such a good example. So a pretty cool timeline. It is a little bit different to some of the Civil War or Revolutionary War timelines, where I think the changes in this one are super minor. You have two dudes like swap round, and then you have this many differences between our timeline and theirs. It is still being written as we speak, so if it interests you, go ahead and check it out. The Able Archer War references something called Able Archer, which in our timeline kind of went off without an incident, but in this timeline ends up going catastrophically. And the Able Archer, or more specifically Able Archer 83, was kind of like this military simulation that was set up. It was a military exercise conducted by NATO, and it was supposed to simulate a nuclear attack or a nuclear war between NATO and the USSR or Warsaw Pact. And this exercise had been done in previous years, but in this new one, they had a bunch of new stuff introduced. They had new codes, they had new exercises, they had new equipment, they had radio silences, different activities, different signals. And so there was some fears by some of the NATO higher-ups that this could be seen as a real military, event, and that the Soviets would take this as kind of an act of war. And on top of that, there were these new, nuclear devices being delivered in Europe. And actually, in our timeline, the Soviets did suspect that this might be a guise, it might be a front, like, oh yeah, we're just doing some military simulation, and this might all be a trick in order for NATO to get kind of the first strike on the Soviets. And so the Soviets at least considered striking first in order to get the, surprise jump on NATO. But as I said, in our timeline, they never actually did, and the exercise ended up getting completed within a few days. And actually, a lot of this information, most of it, was actually top secret up until 2015, when there was a top secret 1990 report that was declassified. And then some more details later came out in 2021. But when these were declassified, we first learned really how close we came to a nuclear war. As I said, the Soviets were suspicious of this whole maneuver, and at the time, they did actually end up preparing their nuclear weapons and even loading a bunch of nuclear warheads onto some military planes. But as I said, in this timeline, the Soviets end up preemptively striking NATO, not with nuclear weapons, mind, but it does spiral into these world wars, into these constant attacks, which leads to more death, destruction, and yeah, not a great ending. Führerreich, Legacy of the Great War is another Hearts of Iron 4 mod, where it's actually an alternate timeline within an alternate timeline. And it takes Kaiserreich, which is a alternate timeline which we've already explored, where basically the US doesn't end up joining World War I. This makes Germany a lot stronger, and they end up beating France and Britain, which then both have these socialist uprisings. The British government flees the British Isles over to Canada, and yeah, crazy timeline. But this is an alternate timeline of that alternate timeline, which says that yes, the US doesn't join World War I, but the twist is that Germany doesn't win. So the Allies win, and then instead of Germany basically taking over the world, Germany loses, and they don't develop the ideology that Adolf was known for, but instead they develop something called Valkism, which is similar in ways to that ideology, in that it's quite militaristic, it's kind of like a dictatorship, but it's more pagan-based, both in kind of their culture, their rituals, and some of their clothing and style. And it's also more socially progressive. So it cares kind of less about the color of your skin or the blood of your ancestors, and more about fighting for the country and fighting for the power of the country. So yeah, a great Hearts of Iron 4 mod. And if you ever end up trying it out, let me know what you think in the comments below. The other network is a very cool creepypasta that I would absolutely recommend you reading if you have just a few minutes. And if you don't want spoilers, then go read it now, as there will be spoilers ahead. But it basically describes this guy who receives an email, and this email is prompting him to visit this strange place in Wales, and he follows the instructions in this email. He heads up to this strange, kind of creepy, abandoned building, and inside he goes around, he explores it, and he finds this desk with a socket in the wall. And this socket is kind of like an internet socket or an Ethernet socket. And so, as instructed by the email, he pulls out his laptop, he pulls out the Ethernet cable, he plugs his laptop into this socket in the wall, and eventually his laptop connects to the other network, that being the internet network of this other reality. So on his computer, Google doesn't exist. It brings up this other search called Patriot Search, and then he starts doing like random searches on random topics and terms, and it pulls up these news stories, these articles, and he slowly reads and finds out about a second American Civil War, about these nukes going off all in Europe, and about martial law being set up in all of these patriot countries around the world. The police are kind of phased out in this new timeline, and they're replaced with more militaristic, soldiers. And just about the only crimes actually being prosecuted are treason and fraud. So you can imagine everybody else committing every other crime, violent crimes, murders, robberies, assaults. That's basically all legal, so, incredibly horrible and dangerous society. Oh, and New York doesn't exist. Like, in his research, there was records going back to like the 1990s, but then it was just like blipped out of existence or something, so that's a little strange. German scientists are arrested for seemingly researching alternate realities and alternate timelines. And then as he's researching all this, as he's reading these articles, his computer receives a ping, which is kind of like a signal from another computer on the network. And he said as far as he knows, this is the only network, it's the only, plug in this side. And so he theorizes that the only place this ping could be from is the other reality. So he's maybe a little curious at first, but that curiosity quickly turns to fear when whoever's pinging him seemingly disables his laptop. The little mouse cursor, it freezes and then eventually just disappears, and then something starts downloading on his computer, this ominous looking file with no name, and it's slowly downloading. He doesn't know what's in it, he doesn't know what it is, and so he panics, and just before it's fully downloaded, he quickly yoinks the cable out of the wall, out of the socket, and that's basically the end of his adventure. He then destroys the laptop. He warns anyone that yes, if you do go to this place, absolutely be careful, be cautious, don't let these people in this other reality into our reality in any way, as it is seemingly a complete hellscape of a world, and we don't know what the ramifications of letting them in would be. So a super fun, super well written creepypasta in my opinion. It's a great alternate dark timeline, kind of everything that creepypastas should and could be. But as I said, go and check it out if you have a few minutes. Ice is a very cool alternate timeline that is explored in this Polish book written in 2007, where the Tunguska event that happened in 1908, and we think it was probably a meteorite that struck. It was a very strange event. But basically in this timeline, the meteorite that fell on Tunguska, it brings down to Earth this strange form of matter called ice. And this ice is extremely cold, like extremely cold. It makes everything else around it very cold as well. And it starts spreading over towards Warsaw and then beyond, coldening everything in its path. It transforms iron into Zimnazo, or cold iron, which has these crazy new properties and opens up the doors for this new technology, this new construction type of stuff. And there are also these strange creatures named the Lute, or Angels of Frost, which are seemingly introduced with this meteorite and now live exclusively just around ice. The ice also, it is said, freezes history and philosophy. It halts political progress, changes the laws of logic from many valued. So, the statement, I am happy, for example, the answer is not just black and white. You can be like, I'm mostly happy, I'm slightly happy, I'm mostly unhappy, I'm kind of in between. So it has many values along this spectrum of truth. But the presence of ice changes logic from being many valued into being two valued. So logically, things are either happy or not happy, which I don't know how a material can change logic. It seems like a super cool, fun idea, definitely sci-fi-ish, and it's a really fantastically written book. It's won a bunch of awards, it's been translated into multiple languages, and the base of the plot basically takes us through this one guy who's been sent up to the ice in order to find his dad, nicknamed Father Frost, because he can apparently communicate with these ice angels. And on the way, he finds out a bunch of interesting things, interesting people. He discovers Nikola Tesla in disguise, who was sent by the Tsar over to the ice to use this new technology that Nikola Tesla has developed in order to basically completely destroy the ice and to free Russia and Moscow of this extreme cold. So yeah, as I said, very cool story. Absolutely check it out. And I have done absolutely no research into how to pronounce this name, so I'm just gonna raw dog this Polish pronunciation, which will go with Rzeczpospolita Zwycięska, or the much more easy to pronounce, nobody did us any harm. But they both explore this timeline where pre-World War II, the West basically pumps money into Poland, and that's in order to strengthen Poland and basically defeat Germany early on. So that does happen. Germany loses World War II a lot faster than in our timeline, and Poland never gets invaded by Germany. They never end up with all of the mass killings that Germany inflicted upon them. And then after the war, Germany gets divided up into these smaller countries, these smaller areas, with Poland taking up a bunch of them and becoming more powerful than in our timeline. Warday is a book written by Whitley Strieber, who also wrote Communion, which is a hilariously fantastic book and film that we covered in the Alien and UFO Iceberg. But Warday explores a timeline where, and this is written in kind of first person, but it's where Whitley Strieber himself is in New York and he witnesses a nuclear attack. And this is in 1988, where the Soviets drop a nuke kind of nearby. And the whole book is basically Whitley documenting his journey as he moves from place to place, essentially settles down, becomes a farmer, and then does some more moving around. And all the while, he's describing the landscape, he's describing the lives of the people in this post-apocalyptic America. And as you can imagine, it is absolutely horrible. It's the brutality of nuclear war. And the war started when America went to launch these things up into space. And it was a whole system that was basically meant to sit up in space and shoot any missiles that were going to America. But apparently the Soviets couldn't let them have this insane defensive technology. And so as it was going up, they kind of shot at it, destroyed it. And this led to one thing, led to another, which ended up with nuclear war. The entire war apparently lasted just 36 minutes, killing 7 million people immediately, as well as obviously many, many more millions with the aftermath, as well as destroying 90% of the US Navy. So yeah, I don't know how many more times you have to say it, but nuclear war absolutely sucks. World War 1990s series explores a timeline where the Warsaw Pact launch an offensive against NATO, and they almost succeed, but they don't in the end, and this whole thing basically leads to World War III. There's lots of back and forth in this series, you know, secret missions, espionage, attacks on countries all around the world, and honestly, looking back at the whole kind of, you know, Warsaw Pact, USSR, NATO thing, it is somewhat of a miracle that nothing like this ended up happening. The tensions were so high at some points in, you know, our original timeline, but it never really ended up escalating too far, especially not to nuclear war. But yeah, in this timeline, it does end up escalating. Tons of war, tons of death, tons of fighting, and the series itself has received, I guess, mixed reviews. Some people love it, they say it's fantastic. Other people say it's absolute tripe. And a lot more people say that it's kind of entertaining. It's like an action film or something. You know, there's a lot of stuff happening. There's a lot of explosions and espionage and spies, but that it's not too historically or militarily accurate, which I guess that matters if you care about stuff like that. And there's actually a new book coming out. So if you want to read through all 8 books in the series and then catch up on this 9th book, you are more than welcome to. And if you have read every book in this series, I think you probably deserve a medal, so definitely let me know down below. And that is all we have time for. There is just one more episode of this alternate timeline iceberg remaining, which honestly has been a long time coming. I'll be happy when this one is completed. We can start exploring other topics, other icebergs, maybe some TV shows, video games, ancient mysteries, civilizations, maybe even a few more alien videos. But I hope you are all having a lovely day, night, or afternoon. And as always, thanks for watching.